The morning frost painted delicate patterns on the windows of Anderson's family kitchen, a cozy restaurant nestled in the heart of historic downtown Rochester, Minnesota. Inside, Michael Anderson meticulously wiped down the counter for the third time that morning, his movements mechanical, devoid of the passion that once drove him to create this warm haven of comfort food and family traditions. The restaurant's walls told a story of happier times through photographs, snapshots of a life that seemed to belong to someone else now. In many of them, a woman with kind eyes and an infectious smile stood beside Mike, their matching wedding bands glinting in the camera flash. Catherine Anderson had been more than just Mike's wife. She had been the heart and soul of Anderson's family kitchen. 5 years had passed since Catherine's battle with an aggressive illness had ended, but for Mike, it might as well have been yesterday. The pain remained as fresh as the coffee he brewed each morning, its bitter taste matching the cynicism that had taken root in his heart. At 50, Mike Anderson had become a shadow of his former self, his once cheerful demeanor replaced by a stoic mask that kept the world at arm's length. The early morning light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the empty tables. The silence was broken only by the gentle whir of the heating system and the occasional scrape of chair legs against the floor. As Mike prepared for another day of serving meals, he no longer took joy in creating. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson." A bright voice cut through his melancholy like a shaft of sunlight through storm clouds. Sarah Mitchell stood in the doorway, her 19-year-old face radiating an optimism that seemed almost offensive in its intensity. She had started working at the restaurant just 2 weeks ago, and already her presence was causing ripples in the carefully maintained pond of Mike's isolation. Mike merely grunted in response, turning his attention back to the counter. Sarah's unwavering cheerfulness reminded him too much of Catherine, and that similarity stirred feelings he'd rather keep buried. The young waitress, however, remained undeterred by his cold shoulder. "I brought some fresh flowers for the tables," Sarah continued, holding up a bundle of bright daisies. "My mom grows them in her greenhouse. I thought they might brighten up the place a little." Mike's jaw tightened. "The tables are fine as they are," he said curtly. But Sarah had already begun placing the flowers in the small vases that had sat empty for the past 5 years. Her movements were gentle and purposeful, each arrangement positioned with care. "My pastor always says that flowers are God's way of painting hope into our daily lives," Sarah shared, her voice soft but clear. "Even in the coldest Minnesota winter, they remind us that spring will come again." Mike's hands stilled on the counter. "Keep your pastor's sayings to yourself, Miss Mitchell. This is a restaurant, not a church." The words came out harsher than he'd intended, but he couldn't bring himself to apologize. Faith was a luxury he'd abandoned long ago, along with the belief that prayers could change anything. Sarah's smile dimmed slightly, but didn't disappear entirely. "Of course, Mr. Anderson. I'm sorry if I overstepped." She tucked her serving apron around her waist and began her opening duties, humming softly as she worked. The morning progressed with its usual routine, regular customers filtering in for their breakfast, the clatter of plates and murmurs of conversation filling the air. Mike worked the kitchen with practiced efficiency, his hands moving through familiar motions while his mind wandered through memories he couldn't seem to shake. He watched from the kitchen window as Sarah interacted with the customers, her genuine warmth drawing smiles from even the gruffest patrons. She had a way about her that was undeniably special, though Mike would never admit it aloud. It was the same quality Catherine had possessed, the ability to make everyone feel like family. As the lunch rush approached, Mike's son, David, called. These daily check-ins had become routine since Catherine's passing, though they rarely discussed anything of substance. David worked as a resident at the Mayo Clinic, following in his mother's footsteps in the medical field. His voice today seemed distracted, tired from another long shift in the emergency department. "Just checking in, Dad. How's the restaurant?" "Same as always," Mike replied, his eyes following Sarah as she gracefully handled a difficult customer with a patience he'd long since lost. "How's work?" "Busy, the usual." There was a pause, then, "You know, Mom would want you to—" "I've got customers waiting, David." Mike cut him off, not ready for another conversation about moving on or finding peace. "I'll talk to you later." He hung up before his son could respond, pushing down the familiar surge of guilt. The kitchen timer buzzed, demanding his attention, and Mike gladly lost himself in the routine of cooking. It was easier than thinking about the concern in his son's voice, or the way Sarah's presence seemed to be slowly chipping away at the walls he'd built around himself. The day continued, each hour marked by the rhythm of orders and meals served until the afternoon lull settled over the restaurant. Mike found himself watching Sarah again as she carefully straightened the flower arrangements, which had somehow managed to make the dining room feel more alive than it had in years. For a brief moment, he could almost hear Catherine's laugh, could almost see her standing beside Sarah, arranging flowers of her own. The vision was so vivid it made his chest ache, and he turned away abruptly, retreating to the safety of his office, where the only flowers were the dried ones in the photograph on his desk, the last bouquet Catherine had ever arranged. The following weeks brought an unseasonable warmth to Rochester, melting the last remnants of winter snow and coaxing early spring flowers from the thawing earth. Inside Anderson's family kitchen, a different kind of thaw was struggling to take hold, though Mike Anderson seemed determined to resist it at every turn. Sarah had settled into her role at the restaurant with an ease that both impressed and unsettled Mike. She knew every regular customer's order by heart, remembered their children's names, and shared in their joys and concerns with genuine interest. More than once, Mike had caught himself wondering if Catherine had somehow guided the young woman to his restaurant. One particularly busy morning, as Sarah rushed between tables with her perpetual smile, she paused to help an elderly woman who had dropped her cane. The simple act of kindness, performed without hesitation or expectation of recognition, sent a sharp pang through Mike's chest. It was exactly what Catherine would have done. "Mr. Anderson," Sarah called out during the afternoon lull, approaching the counter where he was reviewing receipts. "I was wondering if I could make a suggestion about the menu." Mike looked up, his expression guarded. The menu hadn't changed in 5 years, and he had no intention of changing it now. "What about it?" "Well, I noticed we have quite a few customers who come in after church on Sundays, and I thought maybe we could offer a special Sunday brunch menu. Something that brings families together, you know?" Her eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "My grandmother has this amazing recipe for cinnamon roll French toast that would be perfect." The mention of church made Mike's jaw tighten, but before he could dismiss the idea outright, his phone rang. The caller ID showed David's name, and something in Mike's gut told him this wasn't the usual check-in call. "David," Mike answered, turning away from Sarah's hopeful expression. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, a colleague of David's from the hospital. The words that followed seemed to come from a great distance. Emergency department, accident, critical condition. Mike's world narrowed to a tunnel of sound and static. Sarah watched as all color drained from her employer's face. Without thinking, she moved closer, her hand hovering near his elbow in case he needed support. The phone slipped from Mike's grasp, but Sarah caught it before it hit the counter. "Mr. Anderson, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice gentle but steady. "David, he's..." Mike struggled to form the words. "There was an accident at the hospital. He's in critical condition." The reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow, and he gripped the counter for support. "I need to get to Mayo, now." "I'll drive you," Sarah said immediately, already untying her apron. "You're in no condition to drive yourself." When Mike started to protest, she added firmly, "Mr. Anderson, please let me help." The drive to Mayo Clinic was a blur of traffic lights and worried silence. Sarah navigated the familiar streets with careful efficiency, while Mike stared straight ahead, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. The morning's sunshine seemed like a cruel joke now, too bright and cheerful for the darkness threatening to overwhelm him. In the emergency department waiting room, Mike paced like a caged animal while Sarah quietly handled the necessary paperwork. She seemed to know exactly what to do, and Mike was too distraught to question how or why. Hours passed in an agonizing crawl. Sarah never left Mike's side, even after calling the restaurant's evening shift manager to explain the situation. She brought him coffee he didn't drink and food he couldn't eat, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of his fear. When she thought he wasn't looking, Sarah would bow her head slightly, her lips moving in silent prayer. Each time Mike noticed, his anger grew. How could she still believe in a God who would let this happen? Who had taken Catherine and now threatened to take David too? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the waiting room windows, Sarah gently broke the silence. "Mr. Anderson, would you like to pray with me?" Mike whirled on her, all his fear and anger finding a target at last. Pray? He spat the word like a curse. Where was your God when my wife needed him? Where is he now while my son... His voice broke and he turned away, shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. Sarah's voice remained calm, though her eyes shimmered with tears. He's right here with us, Mr. Anderson. In this moment. In this pain. Sometimes faith isn't about getting the answers we want. It's about finding strength we didn't know we had. I don't need your faith, Miss Mitchell, Mike said coldly. What I need is for my son to be okay. And if you can't make that happen, then your prayers are worthless. Everyone's entitled to their beliefs, Mr. Anderson, Sarah replied softly. But pushing away people who care about you won't make the pain any easier to bear. Before Mike could respond, a doctor appeared in the waiting room doorway. Mr. Anderson? The expression on the doctor's face made Mike's heart stop. Sarah instinctively reached for his hand, and to both their surprise, he didn't pull away. The doctor's words echoed through the sterile hospital corridor. David was in a medically induced coma. The technical terms blurred together in Mike's mind. Severe head trauma, swelling, monitoring, waiting, always waiting. The only clear thought was that he couldn't lose his son. Not like this. Not after Catherine. Hours stretched into days. Sarah continued to appear at the hospital after her shifts at the restaurant, bringing fresh clothes, decent coffee, and that unwavering optimism that now grated on Mike's every nerve. She'd arranged for the restaurant's management team to handle daily operations, giving Mike one less thing to worry about, but her constant presence and gentle references to faith pushed him closer to his breaking point. On the fourth day, as David's condition remained unchanged, Mike stood by the window of the ICU waiting room. The sprawling Mayo Clinic campus spread out below, its buildings reaching toward a gray Minnesota sky that threatened snow. Sarah sat nearby, quietly reading from a small Bible she always carried in her purse. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord," she read softly, almost to herself. "Plans to prosper you, and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." Mike's hands clenched into fists. Enough. Sarah looked up, startled by the raw anger in his voice. "I've had enough of your prayers and your Bible verses and your endless optimism," Mike continued, his voice rising. "Where were these wonderful plans when my wife was suffering? Where are they now while my son lies in that bed with machines breathing for him? Mr. Anderson, I only meant to what? To comfort me with empty promises? To tell me that some divine plan makes all this suffering worthwhile?" Mike's laugh was bitter, harsh. "You're 19 years old, Miss Mitchell. What do you know about loss? About watching someone you love slip away while your prayers go unanswered?" Sarah stood slowly, her face pale but composed. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to lose a wife or to watch a child suffer, but I do know that anger and bitterness won't help David heal." "Don't you dare tell me what will or won't help my son," Mike snapped. "You're fired, Miss Mitchell. I don't need your help at the restaurant, and I certainly don't need your prayers." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. "I understand," she said quietly, gathering her things. At the door, she paused. "I'll keep praying for both of you, Mr. Anderson, whether you want me to or not." After she left, Mike sank into a chair, exhaustion washing over him. The room felt emptier somehow, colder. Outside, the threatened snow had begun to fall, fat flakes swirling against the window pane. "Rough day." The voice startled Mike. He hadn't heard anyone enter the waiting room. A man stood in the doorway, tall, lean, with weathered features and clothes that had seen better days. Despite his shabby appearance, his eyes were kind, alive with an intelligence that commanded attention. "The waiting room's closed," Mike said shortly. "Family only." The man smiled, seemingly unperturbed by Mike's brusque tone. "Sometimes family isn't about blood," he said, moving further into the room. "I'm Thomas. I work here. Well, not officially." He gestured to his worn jacket. "I help people find their way when they're lost." "I'm not lost," Mike retorted, "and I don't need help." "No?" Thomas settled into a chair, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "That young lady who just left, she seemed to think differently." Mike's eyes narrowed. "Were you eavesdropping?" "Let's just say I have a way of being where I'm needed," Thomas replied cryptically. "Tell me, Mr. Anderson, Do you really believe firing that girl will make your pain any easier to bear? How do you know my name? Thomas smiled again, that same peaceful expression that somehow made Mike feel both comforted and unsettled. I know many things. I know that 5 years ago you lost your wife Catherine. I know that your son David followed in her footsteps, becoming a doctor to help others. And I know that right now, you're so afraid of losing him that you're pushing away anyone who tries to help you cope with that fear. Mike stood abruptly. Who are you, really? Just a humble observer of human nature, Thomas replied, rising as well. And someone who knows that sometimes the hardest part of faith isn't believing in God, it's believing that we deserve His love, even when we're angry at Him. Before Mike could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway. Mr. Anderson, your son's doctor would like to speak with you. When Mike turned back, Thomas was gone. The only evidence of his presence was a small, smooth stone left on the chair where he'd been sitting. Mike picked it up, turning it over in his hand. On one side, someone had carefully painted a single word: hope. The stone weighed heavily in Mike's pocket as he followed the nurse through the ICU corridors. His conversation with the mysterious Thomas played over in his mind, competing with worry about what David's doctor might say. The snow continued to fall outside, coating Rochester in a blanket of white that muffled the usual sounds of the city. Dr. Emily Weber, David's neurologist, waited at the nurse's station. Her expression gave nothing away, but something in her posture made Mike's heart race. Mr. Anderson, we've noticed some changes in David's brain activity. The swelling has begun to decrease, and he's showing signs of increased responsiveness. Mike gripped the counter, his knees suddenly weak. Is that good news? Cautiously optimistic news, Dr. Weber replied. We're going to start reducing his sedation gradually. The next 24 hours will be crucial. As the doctor continued explaining the process, Mike's hand found the stone in his pocket. The painted word seemed to burn against his palm. Hope. He thought of Sarah's unwavering faith, of Thomas's mysterious appearance and disappearance. For the first time in years, he felt something crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. Back in the waiting room, Mike found himself alone with his thoughts. The snow had picked up, and the hospital's hallways grew quieter as visitors headed home ahead of the worsening weather. He pulled out his phone, scrolling to Sarah's number in the contacts. His thumb hovered over the call button, pride warring with the growing realization that he'd made a terrible mistake in firing her. A soft knock at the door interrupted his deliberation. Coffee? Thomas stood there holding 2 steaming cups from the hospital cafe. Hospital coffee is usually terrible, but I know a secret spot where they keep the good stuff. Mike accepted the cup automatically, still trying to figure out how the man had appeared so suddenly. How did you know I'd be here? Thomas settled into the chair across from him, his movements carrying that same unhurried grace. The same way I know you're thinking about calling that young lady and apologizing. He took a sip of his coffee. Pride's a heavy burden to carry, especially when you're already carrying so much grief. You talk like you know me, Mike said, but the anger from earlier had drained away, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. I know what it's like to lose faith, Thomas replied. To be so hurt by life that you start to believe it's easier not to believe in anything at all. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. But here's the thing about faith, Mr. Anderson. It's not about getting what we pray for, it's about finding the strength to keep going even when those prayers seem to go unanswered. Mike stared into his coffee cup, the warmth seeping into his cold hands. Sarah, she reminds me so much of Catherine. The way she sees the good in everything, the way she refuses to give up hope. He swallowed hard. It hurts to be around that kind of faith when you've lost your own. Maybe that's exactly why she came into your life, Thomas suggested. Catherine's gone, but the love she represented, that boundless, hopeful love, it's still out there. Sometimes it shows up in unexpected ways through unexpected people. A comfortable silence fell between them as the snow continued to paint the world outside white. Mike found himself telling Thomas about Catherine, about the early days of the restaurant, about David's decision to become a doctor. The words flowed easier than they had in years, and Thomas listened with an attention that seemed to encompass more than just the stories being told. As midnight approached, a nurse appeared with unexpected news. David had squeezed her hand during routine neurological checks. It was small, possibly reflexive, but it was something. Mike's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone again. no longer hesitating as he dialed Sarah's number. It went to voicemail. "Sarah, this is Mike Anderson. I'm sorry. About everything. David? Mike's voice caught. "Please call me back. Please." When he looked up, Thomas was gone again. In his place was another painted stone, this one bearing the word faith. Mike picked it up, holding it together with the first stone, their weight somehow comforting in his palm. The night stretched on, marked by the quiet beeping of monitors and the soft footsteps of nurses making their rounds. Mike dozed fitfully in the waiting room chair, the stones clutched in his hand. His dreams were a mix of memories: Catherine's laugh, David's first steps, Sarah's gentle smile, Thomas's knowing eyes. As dawn broke over Rochester, painting the snow-covered city in shades of pink and gold, Mike was awakened by a gentle touch on his shoulder. Sarah stood there, her eyes red-rimmed but her smile as warm as ever. "I got your message," she said simply. "I came as soon as I could." She held up a familiar paper bag. "I brought those cinnamon rolls you pretend not to like." Mike stood, the stone still warm in his hand. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I was wrong about everything." "Not everything," she corrected gently. "You were right, that I don't know what it's like to lose someone like you lost Catherine. But that doesn't mean I can't help you remember how to hope again." Before Mike could respond, an urgent call came over the hospital's intercom. "Code Blue, ICU room 412, David's room." The words Code Blue seemed to freeze time itself. Mike ran toward David's room, his heart pounding in his chest with Sarah close behind. Medical staff rushed past them, their urgent voices echoing through the sterile hallway. As they reached the ICU, a nurse stopped them from entering the room. Through the glass window, Mike watched the medical team work with practiced efficiency. Dr. Weber called out orders, her voice calm but firm. Each second felt like an eternity. Each beep of the monitors, a reminder of how fragile life could be. Sarah's hand found Mike's, and this time he gripped it tightly, the painted stone still clutched in his other palm. Her lips moved in silent prayer, and for the first time, Mike found himself wanting to believe, wanting to hope. "Please," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to God, to David, or to the universe itself. "Please." The next few minutes were a blur of activity and tension. Then, gradually, the urgency in the room began to subside. Dr. Weber emerged, her face showing signs of relief. "He's stable," she announced. "In fact, he's doing more than that. He's fighting the ventilator, trying to breathe on his own." This could be a very good sign. Mike's knees buckled slightly, and Sarah helped him to a nearby chair. The relief was so intense it was almost painful. Dr. Weber continued explaining that they would begin removing David's breathing tube, that his increased brain activity was promising, that everything was moving in the right direction. As the morning progressed, the ICU settled back into its routine rhythm. Sarah disappeared briefly, returning with fresh coffee and breakfast from the hospital cafeteria. They sat together in David's room, watching the sun rise over Rochester through the window, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. "I keep thinking about Thomas," Mike said suddenly, rolling the painted stones between his fingers. "Have you seen him around the hospital? Tall man, kind of weathered-looking." Sarah shook her head. "I don't think so." "Was he here last night?" Mike described his encounters with the mysterious visitor, showing Sarah the stones. She examined them carefully, her expression thoughtful. "You know, there's something familiar about these. They remind me of the prayer stones at my church." "Prayer stones?" "Yes, we have a meditation garden where people leave painted stones with words of encouragement. But those stones stay in the garden. I've never seen anyone carry them around." She handed them back to Mike. "Maybe Thomas is connected to the church somehow." Before Mike could respond, a small sound from David's bed caught their attention. His fingers were moving, twitching against the sheets. Dr. Weber had said this might happen as the sedation wore off, but seeing it brought fresh tears to Mike's eyes. Sarah squeezed his hand. "Would you like to pray with me?" she asked gently, and this time Mike nodded, his throat too tight for words. As Sarah's soft voice filled the room with words of hope and healing, Mike found himself thinking of Catherine. He could almost hear her voice joining Sarah's, could almost feel her presence in the room. For the first time since losing her, the memory didn't bring only pain. The morning shifted into afternoon. marked by regular visits from the medical team and a steady stream of encouraging signs from David. His breathing continued to improve, his reflexes strengthened, and his brain activity showed increasing responsiveness to stimuli. During a quiet moment, Mike turned to Sarah. "Why did you come back after the way I treated you?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "Because that's what faith is about. Believing in the good in people even when they don't believe in it themselves." She smiled softly. "And because I saw something in you from the first day at the restaurant. Behind all that pain and anger, there's still so much love." Mike thought about the restaurant, about how it had changed since Sarah started working there. The flowers she brought, the way she remembered every customer's name, the warmth she had reintroduced to a place that had grown cold with grief. It was as if she had somehow channeled Catherine's spirit, bringing life back to the spaces that had been empty for so long. "The Sunday brunch idea," he said suddenly. "The one you mentioned before. Tell me more about it." Sarah's face lit up, and she began describing her vision of family-style meals and community gatherings. As she talked, Mike could see it clearly. Tables filled with laughter, the restaurant once again becoming the place of warmth and connection that he and Catherine had dreamed of creating. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Both turned, expecting to see a nurse or doctor, but instead Thomas stood in the doorway, his presence somehow both surprising and completely natural. "Hope and faith," he said, nodding at the stones in Mike's hand. "Powerful things when they work together." He moved into the room with that same unhurried grace, stopping at David's bedside. "Your son has his mother's strength, you know. And your heart, though you've tried hard to hide it lately." Sarah watched the interaction with curious eyes, her expression suggesting she sensed something special about Thomas's presence. The room seemed to fill with a peaceful energy, like the calm after a storm. Thomas placed a third painted stone on David's bedside table. This one bore the word love in the same careful script as the others. "Sometimes," he said, looking directly at Mike, "the hardest part of healing isn't the physical recovery. It's learning to open your heart again, to trust that love is worth the risk of loss." As he spoke, David's fingers twitched again, and this time his eyelids fluttered. Mike and Sarah moved closer to the bed, their hearts racing with anticipation. When they looked back, Thomas had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving only the 3 stones as evidence of his visits. The next few days brought a series of small miracles to room 412. David's recovery continued to surprise even the most experienced medical staff at Mayo Clinic. Each hour brought new signs of improvement, a squeeze of a hand, a flutter of eyelids, small but significant victories in the battle for consciousness. Mike rarely left the hospital, but Sarah made sure he ate regularly, took walks around the building, and even convinced him to go home briefly to shower and change clothes. She had temporarily rearranged her schedule at the restaurant, working morning shifts so she could spend afternoons and evenings at the hospital. During one of their quiet conversations, Mike found himself sharing stories about Catherine with Sarah, how they had met in college, their dreams of opening the restaurant, the way she had touched everyone's lives with her kindness and faith. "She would have loved you," Mike said softly, surprising himself with the admission. "You have her way of seeing the best in people." Sarah smiled, her eyes glistening. "From everything you've told me about her, I wish I could have known her. But Mr. Anderson," she paused, then continued gently, "I think she's still here in a way. In the love you have for David, in the restaurant you built together, in the lives you've touched." Mike fingered the 3 stones that now sat on David's bedside table: hope, faith, and love. He had searched the hospital for Thomas, asked staff members about him, but no one seemed to know who he was talking about. The mystery of the man's identity deepened with each passing day. On a snowy Wednesday afternoon, as Sarah read quietly from her Bible and Mike dozed in the visitor's chair, a new sound filled the room: a rough, weak cough followed by a confused mumble. Mike's eyes snapped open to find David looking back at him, conscious and alert for the first time in weeks. "Dad?" David's voice was hoarse from disuse, but it was the most beautiful sound Mike had ever heard. The next few hours were a whirlwind of medical checks, neurological tests, and tearful reunions. David's recovery was being called remarkable by the medical team, though he had a long road of rehabilitation ahead. Through it all, Sarah remained a steady presence, her joy as genuine as if David were her own family. During a quiet moment when David had drifted back to sleep, Mike found himself drawn to the hospital's small chapel. He hadn't entered a place of worship since Catherine's funeral, but something, perhaps Thomas's influence or Sarah's unwavering faith or simply the miracle of David's recovery, pulled him through the doors. The chapel was empty except for a familiar figure sitting in the back pew. Thomas looked up as Mike entered, that same peaceful smile on his weathered face. "I was wondering when you'd find your way here," he said softly. Mike sat beside him, the painted stones heavy in his pocket. "Who are you?" he asked again, but this time the question held no suspicion, only wonder. Thomas's eyes held a depth of wisdom that seemed both ancient and immediate. "I'm someone who knows what it's like to lose everything and find it again in unexpected ways. Someone who understands that sometimes the greatest acts of faith are the smallest ones, like letting a young waitress put flowers on restaurant tables, or admitting that you're not meant to carry your grief alone." Mike looked at the simple wooden cross at the front of the chapel, remembering how Catherine had found such peace in her faith, even in her final days. "I've been so angry," he admitted, "at God, at the world, at myself. I thought if I closed myself off enough, nothing could hurt me like that again." "And how did that work out for you?" Thomas asked, though his tone held no judgment. Mike laughed softly, the sound surprising him. "About as well as you'd expect." He paused, thinking of Sarah's presence in his life, of David's miraculous recovery, of the way his heart had begun to thaw despite his best efforts to keep it frozen. I think Catherine's been trying to tell me something all along. Through Sarah, through you, through everything that's happened. And what's that? That love is worth the risk. That faith isn't about getting what you pray for. It's about finding the strength to keep going, to keep loving, no matter what happens." Mike turned to look at Thomas directly, but the man was gone. In his place lay a fourth painted stone, this one bearing a single word: "Begin." Outside the chapel windows, the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow across the snow-covered grounds of Mayo Clinic. Mike held the new stone together with the others, their combined weight somehow lighter than before. As he walked back to David's room, where Sarah sat reading quietly by the bedside, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the stirring of new possibilities, the courage to begin again. Spring arrived early in Rochester that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed to mirror the changes in the Anderson family. David's recovery progressed steadily, moving from the ICU to a regular room and finally to the rehabilitation wing of Mayo Clinic. The doctors called his progress remarkable, though they cautioned that the journey back to full health would take time and patience. Sarah continued to divide her time between the restaurant and the hospital, her presence becoming so natural that neither Anderson could imagine their lives without her. During David's physical therapy sessions, she would often bring her laptop to work on new menu ideas for the restaurant, her enthusiasm infectious as she shared her vision with Mike. One afternoon, as David worked with his therapist on rebuilding his strength, Mike found himself watching the easy way Sarah interacted with his son. She had a knack for knowing exactly when to offer encouragement and when to step back, her intuition remarkable for someone so young. "She's something special, isn't she?" David said quietly, after the therapist had left them alone for a break. His voice still carried traces of fatigue, but his eyes were clear and focused as they followed Sarah's movement around the room. Mike nodded, noting the way his son's expression softened when he looked at her. It was a look he recognized, the same way he had once looked at Catherine. "She reminds me so much of your mother sometimes," he admitted, "the way she lights up a room, how she sees the good in everything." David was quiet for a moment, contemplating his father's words. "You know, when I was in the coma, I had these dreams. Or maybe they were something else. I felt Mom's presence, but there was someone else too. A man I'd never met, but who seemed so familiar." Mike's hand instinctively went to his pocket, where he still carried the 4 painted stones. "Tall guy, weathered face, seemed to know everything about us?" David's eyes widened. "You've seen him too?" "I thought it was just the medications." Before Mike could respond, Sarah returned with fresh water for David and news about the restaurant. "Mr. Anderson, you won't believe this. Remember that Sunday brunch idea we discussed? Well, I took the liberty of creating a sample menu and showing it to some of our regular customers. They're already asking when we're going to start." Her excitement was contagious, and Mike found himself caught up in her enthusiasm. The restaurant had been running on autopilot for so long, maintaining the same menu and routines that Catherine had established. Maybe it was time for something new. "Show me what you've got," he said, pulling up a chair beside her. David watched with interest as Sarah pulled out her notebook, filled with carefully detailed plans and menu items. "I was thinking we could start with your classic breakfast items, but add some special touches," she explained, flipping through pages of notes. "Like your signature pancakes, but with seasonal fruit compotes. And maybe we could do family-style servings, encourage people to share and connect." As she talked, Mike could see it clearly. Tables filled with families sharing meals and memories, the restaurant once again becoming the warm, welcoming place Catherine had always envisioned. He glanced at David, who was watching Sarah with undisguised admiration. "What do you think, son?" Mike asked, though he already knew the answer from David's expression. "I think it's brilliant," David replied, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Just like everything else Sarah does." A slight blush colored Sarah's cheeks, and Mike noticed the way her hands lingered when she helped David with his water glass. There was something growing between them, something pure and precious that reminded Mike of his early days with Catherine. Later that evening, as Sarah gathered her things to leave, Mike pulled her aside. "You know, if we're going to implement these changes at the restaurant, you'll need a better title than waitress. How does assistant manager sound?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Mr. Anderson, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he replied simply. "And please call me Mike. I think we're past the formalities now." After Sarah left, Mike sat with David, who was looking more tired but content. "Dad," he said hesitantly, "there's something I need to tell you about Sarah." Mike smiled knowingly. "That you're falling in love with her?" David's surprise was evident. "How did you—" "Son, I may have been blind to a lot of things these past few years, but I'm not blind to the way you look at her, or the way she looks at you." Mike leaned forward in his chair. "Your mother would have approved, you know. Sarah has her kind of spirit." David's eyes grew misty. "I keep thinking about what Sarah told me, about how she felt drawn to apply for the job at the restaurant, how something just told her she needed to be there. Do you think maybe your mother had something to do with it?" Mike finished, touching the stones in his pocket. "I'm beginning to believe there's more to faith than I've been willing to admit these past few years." Through the hospital room window, they could see the sun setting over Rochester, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Spring flowers were beginning to bloom in the hospital gardens below, and somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing. "Tell me more about this man you saw," David said suddenly. "The one in your dreams?" Mike pulled out the painted stones, laying them on David's bedside table one by one. "Hope, faith, love, begin." As he began to tell his son about Thomas's mysterious appearances, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, Catherine was smiling. The first Sunday brunch at Anderson's family kitchen was a testament to new beginnings. The restaurant had been transformed under Sarah's careful direction. Fresh flowers on every table, the smell of cinnamon rolls and coffee filling the air, and soft morning light streaming through windows that somehow seemed cleaner and brighter than before. David, now strong enough for short outings from the hospital, sat at a corner table with Sarah, watching his father move among the customers with a warmth that had been absent for years. Mike stopped at each table, sharing stories and listening to families talk about their own traditions and memories. "I can't believe how different everything feels," David said, his hand finding Sarah's under the table. "It's like the restaurant has come alive again." Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "Your father's come alive again too. Sometimes people just need a reminder that it's okay to hope, to believe in something bigger than themselves." The brunch was a success beyond their expectations. The new menu items, including Sarah's grandmother's cinnamon roll French toast, received rave reviews, but it was the atmosphere that people commented on most. There was a sense of community, of shared joy that had been missing from the restaurant for too long. As the last customers left and the staff began cleaning up, Mike found himself standing in front of the wall of photographs. Among the familiar images of his life with Catherine, there were now new additions. A picture of David's first steps in physical therapy, Sarah arranging flowers at the counter, the entire staff gathered for the Sunday brunch preparation. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Sarah's voice was gentle as she joined him by the wall. Mike smiled, touching one of the older photographs. Catherine always said a restaurant should be more than just a place to eat. It should be a place where memories are made. I forgot that somewhere along the way. But you're remembering now, Sarah replied. That's what matters. David approached them slowly, still using a cane but growing stronger each day. The doctors say I might be ready to go home next week, he announced. Though I'll still need to do outpatient therapy for a while. Mike turned to his son, seeing not just the man he was now, but all the versions of him that had led to this moment. The baby in Catherine's arms, the boy who dreamed of becoming a doctor like his mother, the dedicated resident who had nearly lost his life helping others. You'll stay with me, of course, Mike said. Your old room is exactly as you left it. Actually, David began, glancing at Sarah, we've been talking about that. Sarah's lease is up next month, and we thought maybe… Mike held up his hand, trying to hide his smile. Let me guess, you two want to get a place together? The young couple exchanged surprised looks. How did you know we were thinking about that? Sarah asked. Because I've seen the way you look at each other, Mike replied. The same way Catherine and I used to look at each other. Besides, he added with a wink, I may have found these in the break room. He pulled out a stack of apartment listings Sarah had printed, complete with her neat annotations in the margins. Sarah blushed, but David pulled her closer, dropping a kiss on her forehead. We weren't sure how to tell you, David admitted. We didn't want you to think we were rushing things. Mike thought about Thomas's words in the hospital chapel, about love being worth the risk. Life's too short to waste time worrying about what others might think, he said. If you two have found something special, you should hold on to it. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she hugged Mike tightly. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the restaurant windows as they finished cleaning up. Mike insisted on driving David back to the hospital himself, leaving Sarah to handle the final closing duties as the new assistant manager. As they pulled into the hospital parking lot, David turned to his father. You know what's strange? I haven't seen Thomas since I woke up, but I feel like he's still watching over us somehow. Mike touched the stones in his pocket. He'd taken to carrying them everywhere. Maybe that's exactly what he was meant to do. Help us find our way back to each other, back to faith. Later that evening, after David was settled in his hospital room and Sarah had texted to confirm the restaurant was properly closed, Mike decided to take a walk through the hospital gardens. The spring air was crisp and clean, carrying the promise of new life. Near a bench overlooking a small fountain, he found another painted stone. This one bore the word trust in the familiar handwriting. Next to it was a simple note. Sometimes angels wear weathered jackets. T. Mike picked up both the stone and the note, his heart full of an emotion he couldn't quite name, something between gratitude and awe. Above him, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance church bells were ringing again. He thought about the Sunday brunch, about David and Sarah's growing love, about the way his own heart had begun to heal. Catherine had always said that God works in mysterious ways, and for the first time in years, Mike found himself truly believing it. Walking back to his car, he passed the hospital chapel. Through the windows, he could see a tall figure arranging flowers on the altar, but when he looked again, the chapel was empty. Mike smiled, adding the new stone to his collection. Some mysteries, he was learning, were better left unexplained. The Minnesota summer arrived in full force, bringing warm breezes and long golden evenings to Rochester. David's recovery had progressed remarkably. He now walked without a cane and had begun discussing his eventual return to work at Mayo Clinic, though in a less demanding role than before. The accident had given him a new perspective on life and the importance of balance. Sarah and David had found a cozy apartment just a few blocks from both the restaurant and the hospital, a charming second-floor unit in an old Victorian house with bay windows and hardwood floors. On moving day, Mike insisted on helping, though his help mostly consisted of directing where furniture should go and sharing stories about David's childhood with Sarah. Did he tell you about the time he tried to perform surgery on his stuffed animals? Mike asked. Unpacking a box of kitchen items while Sarah arranged them in cupboards, Catherine caught him using her real medical instruments. She was torn between being horrified and proud. Sarah laughed, the sound mixing with the summer breeze that drifted through the open windows. He's still like that, so dedicated to helping others that he sometimes forgets to take care of himself. That's why he needs you, Mike replied softly. You remind him to slow down, to appreciate the small moments. David appeared in the doorway, carrying the last box from the moving truck. Are you two talking about me again? Only the embarrassing stories, Sarah teased, crossing the room to help him with the box. Their movements around each other were natural, comfortable, as if they'd been dancing this dance for years instead of months. Later that evening, after Mike had left and the majority of the unpacking was done, Sarah and David sat on their small balcony, watching the sunset paint the Rochester skyline in shades of pink and gold. A gentle wind carried the sound of distant church bells, and Sarah's Bible lay open on the small table between them. I've been thinking, David said, his voice thoughtful, about Thomas, about everything that happened at the hospital. Do you really believe he was an angel? Sarah considered the question carefully. I believe God sends us help in whatever form we'll accept it. Sometimes that's a mysterious stranger. Sometimes it's a painted stone, and sometimes, she squeezed his hand, it's a job at a restaurant that leads you to exactly where you're meant to be. David pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. You know, when I was in the coma, I had these dreams. I saw Mom. She was standing in a garden and she was smiling. She told me it wasn't my time yet, that I had more love to give and receive. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. I think she was talking about you. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I wish I could have known her. You do know her, David replied. Through Dad's stories, through the restaurant, through the way you've helped heal our family without even trying. It's like she guided you to us somehow. The next morning, Sarah arrived early at Anderson's family kitchen to help prepare for Sunday brunch. She found Mike already there, arranging fresh flowers on the tables, a task he had taken over from her, though he pretended it was just because he was already there early anyway. David told me about his dreams, she said, as she helped him with the arrangements. About seeing Catherine? Mike nodded, his hands gentle with the blooms. I'm not surprised. She always had a way of showing up when we needed her most. He pulled something from his pocket, the collection of painted stones, now including the newest one marked Trust. Sometimes I think about that first day I came here, Sarah said, touching the stones reverently. I had just finished praying for guidance, asking God to show me where I could make a difference. Then I saw the help wanted sign in your window, and something just told me this was where I needed to be. Catherine always said there are no coincidences, Mike replied. Only God's perfect timing. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the crystals Sarah had hung near the entrance. They scattered rainbow light across the walls, creating patterns that seemed to dance with each breeze. The restaurant had transformed over the past months, becoming not just a place to eat, but a true community gathering spot. As they prepared for the brunch crowd, Mike watched Sarah move through the restaurant with confident grace. She had brought so much more than just new menu ideas and organizational skills. She had brought hope, faith, and love back into their lives. The regular customers began arriving, many now feeling more like family than patrons. They commented on the flowers, on the warm atmosphere, on how the restaurant felt more alive than ever. Mike knew they were right. Anderson's family kitchen had rediscovered its soul. David arrived just before the rush, still moving a bit slowly but with steady determination. He helped seat customers and chat with regulars, seamlessly fitting into the restaurant's rhythm. More than once, Mike caught him watching Sarah with such pure adoration that it made his heart ache with remembered joy. Near the end of the brunch service, as Sarah was arranging fresh flowers in the entrance phase, she found another painted stone hidden among the stems. This one read, Forever. She showed it to David, who took it with trembling hands, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared understanding. Mike, watching from across the restaurant, smiled to himself. He had seen David slip the ring box into his pocket that morning, had recognized the nervous energy in his son's movements. Some moments were sacred, meant to unfold in their own perfect time. Outside, the summer sun continued its arc across the Minnesota sky, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang out their eternal song of faith, hope, and love. The proposal didn't happen quite the way David had planned. He had envisioned an elaborate setup at the restaurant, maybe during a special dinner service, but fate, or perhaps divine intervention, had other ideas. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening, as they walked through the Peace Garden at Sarah's church. David had been carrying the ring for days, waiting for the perfect moment. They passed the meditation area, where painted stones similar to Thomas's lay in careful arrangements, each bearing words of hope and inspiration. Sarah was telling him about her plans for the restaurant's upcoming community outreach program, an initiative to provide meals to elderly residents who couldn't leave their homes. Her face was animated with excitement, her hands moving expressively as she talked about coordinating with local churches and community centers. "You know what I love most about you?" David interrupted softly, causing Sarah to pause mid-sentence. "You're always thinking about others, always finding ways to spread light in the world." Sarah blushed, but before she could respond, David continued, "When I was in that hospital bed, trapped in darkness, you were my light. You brought hope, not just to me, but to my father, to our whole family. You helped us remember what it means to believe in something bigger than ourselves." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the painted stone marked "Forever," along with a small velvet box. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as David carefully lowered himself to one knee. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "will you help me spread light in the world for the rest of our lives?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she nodded, unable to speak. When David slipped the ring onto her finger, a delicate vintage piece that had belonged to Catherine, they both felt a warm breeze sweep through the garden, carrying the sweet scent of summer flowers. Back at Anderson's family kitchen, Mike was closing up for the night when he found another painted stone on the counter, this one bearing the word "Joy." Next to it was a familiar weathered jacket, though its owner was nowhere to be seen. The news of David and Sarah's engagement spread quickly through their little community. The restaurant buzzed with excitement as regular customers offered congratulations and shared their own love stories. Mike found himself sharing more stories about Catherine, finding that the memories now brought more comfort than pain. One evening, as Mike was helping Sarah plan the wedding reception menu, she asked him a question that had been on her mind. "Do you think Thomas will be there at the wedding?" Mike looked at the collection of painted stones that now sat in a special display case near the restaurant's entrance. "I have a feeling he'll be there whether we see him or not." The wedding plans came together with the same natural ease that seemed to characterize Sarah and David's relationship. They chose to hold the ceremony in Sarah's church, with the reception at Anderson's family kitchen, a decision that felt right to everyone involved. As the big day approached, Mike found himself spending more time in the hospital chapel where he had first really talked with Thomas. Something about the quiet space helped him feel connected to both Catherine and the mysterious stranger, who had helped guide them all back to faith. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, a perfect Minnesota summer day. The church filled with friends, family, and regular customers from the restaurant who had become like family. Mike stood in the back, watching the guests arrive, when he felt a familiar presence beside him. "Beautiful day for a wedding," Thomas said quietly. Mike turned, not surprised to find the mysterious man looking exactly as he had all those months ago in the hospital. "I was hoping you'd come." Thomas smiled, his weathered face peaceful. "I wouldn't miss it. Catherine's been looking forward to this day for a long time." Before Mike could respond to this remarkable statement, Thomas handed him one last painted stone. This one read, "Miracle." "You know," Thomas said, his eyes twinkling, "sometimes the greatest miracles aren't the big dramatic moments. Sometimes they're the small choices we make, to love, to believe, to begin again." The church bells began to ring, signaling it was time for the ceremony to begin. When Mike turned to thank Thomas, the man was gone, leaving only the faint scent of hospital chapel flowers in his wake. The ceremony was everything they had hoped for, and more. Sarah was radiant in a simple white dress, carrying a bouquet that included the same type of daisies she had brought to the restaurant on her first day of work. David stood tall and strong at the altar, no trace remaining of his injury, except a slight scar above his eyebrow. As Mike walked Sarah down the aisle, an honor she had tearfully requested months ago, he felt Catherine's presence more strongly than ever. The painted stones in his pocket seemed to warm with each step, like small reminders of the journey that had brought them all to this moment. Later, during the reception at the restaurant, Mike stood to give his toast. He looked out at the gathered faces, at David and Sarah, at their friends and family, at the community they had built together, and felt his heart swell with gratitude. "Catherine used to say that love is God's greatest gift to us," he began, his voice strong and clear. She believed that true love never ends. It just finds new ways to express itself. Looking at David and Sarah, I know she was right. He raised his glass, the evening sunlight catching the ring on Sarah's finger. Catherine's ring now given new life and meaning. To love, to faith, and to new beginnings. As the guests echoed his toast, a warm breeze swept through the restaurant, making the crystals near the entrance dance and scatter rainbow light across the walls. And there, on the windowsill, appeared one final painted stone, bearing a single word: blessed. The months following David and Sarah's wedding brought more changes to Anderson's family kitchen. The Sunday brunches had become so popular that they needed to expand their hours, and Sarah's community outreach program was touching more lives than anyone had anticipated. But the biggest change came on a crisp autumn morning, when Sarah shared some unexpected news. "I'm pregnant," she announced during a quiet moment before the restaurant opened. She and David had wanted to tell Mike first, before sharing the news with anyone else. Mike stood frozen for a moment, memories of Catherine's joy when they learned about David washing over him. Then he pulled them both into a tight embrace, his eyes glistening with tears of happiness. "Your mother would be so proud," he whispered to David, his voice thick with emotion. "So incredibly proud." As Sarah's pregnancy progressed, the restaurant seemed to glow with anticipation. Regular customers brought gifts and shared parenting advice, and Mike found himself remembering all the little things Catherine had done to prepare for David's arrival. Sarah had the same gentle determination Catherine had shown, working steadily despite morning sickness and fatigue. One evening, as they were closing up, Sarah found herself drawn to the wall of photographs. Among the newer additions, pictures of her wedding, the successful Sunday brunches and community events, the older photos of Catherine seemed to shine with renewed significance. "I had another dream about Thomas last night," she said softly as Mike joined her. He was in the hospital chapel arranging flowers, but they weren't regular flowers. They were made of light. Mike touched the collection of painted stones that still held a place of honor near the entrance. "I've been doing some research," he said, "about the hospital, about Thomas, and I found something interesting." He pulled out an old newspaper clipping he'd discovered in the Mayo Clinic archives. The yellowed paper showed a photograph of the hospital chapel from the 1960s. In it, a familiar figure stood arranging flowers on the altar. Tall, weathered face, kind eyes. The caption says his name was Thomas Grace, Mike explained, his voice quiet with awe. He was a chaplain at Mayo for over 40 years. According to the article, he was known for helping families find hope in their darkest moments. He would paint stones with inspiring words and leave them for people who needed encouragement. Sarah's hand went to her growing belly, a gesture that had become automatic. When did he serve at the hospital?" Mike met her eyes. "He served there until 1975, when he himself succumbed to an illness." The article says he worked until the very end, still bringing comfort to others even as his own health failed. The implications of this information hung in the air between them. Thomas had appeared to them decades after his time at Mayo Clinic, looking exactly as he did in the photograph. "There's more," Mike continued, pulling out another piece of paper. "I found records of a connection I never knew existed. Thomas Grace was the chaplain who helped Catherine's parents when she was born prematurely at Mayo Clinic. He gave them a painted stone with the word faith on it, the same kind of stone he gave us." Sarah sank into a nearby chair, one hand still resting on her belly. "So when he appeared to he was continuing his ministry," Mike finished, "still helping families find their way back to faith, still bringing hope to those who needed it most." The restaurant was quiet, except for the gentle tinkling of the crystals near the window, stirred by an inexplicable breeze. The painted stones seemed to glow softly in their display case. Each word, hope, faith, love, begin, trust, forever, joy, miracle, blessed, telling part of their story. "David needs to see this," Sarah said, reaching for her phone. But before she could make the call, she gasped, her hand pressing more firmly against her belly. "Sarah, are you all right?" Mike asked, concern evident in his voice. She smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. "The baby. I just felt it move for the first time." As if in response to this moment, another painted stone appeared on the windowsill, bearing the word gift. Next to it, lay a single flower, a daisy, like the one Sarah had brought to the restaurant on her first day, but this one seemed to shimmer with an inner light. Mike picked up both the stone and the flower, adding them to their collection. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the trees, carrying the sound of distant church bells. Somewhere in the hospital chapel, they knew, Thomas Grace was still watching over his flock, bringing comfort to those who needed it most. Sarah looked at the old photograph again, then at the wall of their own family pictures. "Do you think—" She hesitated, then continued. "Do you think Catherine and Thomas know each other now?" "In heaven," Mike smiled, remembering all the times he'd felt Catherine's presence over the past year, all the ways their family had been guided back to faith and love. "I think they've been working together all along," he said softly, "watching over us, helping us find our way back to each other." As the evening light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the restaurant floor, both Mike and Sarah felt a profound sense of peace. The mystery of Thomas Grace hadn't been solved so much as illuminated, revealing a divine plan more beautiful and intricate than they could have imagined. Spring returned to Rochester, bringing with it new life in more ways than one. The morning Sarah went into labor, the restaurant's crystals scattered rainbow light across the walls with unprecedented brilliance, as if celebrating what was to come. David called from the hospital with updates throughout the day, his voice trembling with excitement and anxiety. Mike kept himself busy preparing food for the staff at Mayo Clinic's labor and delivery unit, something Catherine had always done when one of their extended restaurant family was having a baby. As evening approached, Mike made his way to the hospital, carrying baskets of fresh bread and containers of homemade soup. The same halls he had walked in despair during David's accident now felt filled with hope and anticipation. He stopped by the chapel on his way to the maternity ward, drawn by an inexplicable urge. The space was empty, except for fresh flowers on the altar, daisies arranged in a pattern he recognized from Thomas's style. "I knew you'd come here first," a familiar voice said from behind him. Mike turned to find Thomas standing there, looking exactly as he had in the old photograph from 1975. "I hoped I'd see you today," Mike replied. Thomas smiled, his weathered face peaceful. "Some moments are too important to miss. Catherine's been looking forward to this day for a long time. You've known her all along, haven't you? Been watching over our family since before she was born?" "God's love works in mysterious ways," Thomas said. "Sometimes it takes the form of a chaplain who never really left his post, or a young waitress with unshakable faith, or a restaurant that becomes a sanctuary for healing hearts." Before Mike could respond, his phone buzzed with a message from David. "It's time." "You should go," Thomas said softly. "Your family needs you." "Will I see you again?" Mike asked, though he already knew the answer. Thomas's smile held all the wisdom and peace of heaven. "I'm never far from those who need hope. Just look for the stones and remember, love never ends, it just finds new ways to shine." When Mike reached the delivery room, he found David and Sarah surrounded by the gentle bustle of medical staff. Sarah's face was tired but radiant, and David looked at her with such love it made Mike's heart ache with joy. The baby arrived as the evening sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Her boy, healthy and strong, with eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of angels. When they placed him in Mike's arms, he felt Catherine's presence so strongly it took his breath away. "We want to name him Thomas," Sarah said softly. "Thomas Michael Anderson." Mike looked at his grandson, tears blurring his vision. On the windowsill of the hospital room, a new painted stone had appeared bearing the word Legacy. In the days that followed, Anderson's family kitchen buzzed with celebration. Regular customers brought gifts and shared in the joy of baby Thomas's arrival. The wall of photographs gained a new centerpiece, a picture of 4 generations. Baby Thomas, David and Sarah, Mike, and in the background, barely visible but unmistakably present, the smiling face of Catherine in one of the older photographs. One Sunday morning, as Mike prepared for brunch service, he found Sarah in the restaurant's entrance, showing baby Thomas the crystals that scattered rainbow light across his curious face. The painted stones gleamed in their display case, telling their family's story of hope, faith and love. "Look at these, little one," Sarah was saying softly. "Each one is a reminder that angels walk among us, helping us find our way back to love." Mike watched them, his heart full. The restaurant had become everything Catherine had dreamed it could be, not just a place to eat, but a true sanctuary where families gathered, where hope was served alongside daily specials, where faith could be restored over a simple cup of coffee. David joined them, wrapping his arms around his wife and son. "Dad," he called out, "come look at this." On the windowsill lay one final painted stone, its message simple but profound: eternal. Next to it was a daisy that seemed to glow with inner light, and a note in familiar handwriting. "Love is God's greatest miracle. It never truly leaves us. It just transforms, like light through a crystal, touching each life it encounters in new and beautiful ways. Keep spreading that light." With eternal love, Thomas Grace and Catherine Anderson. The morning sun streamed through the windows. The crystals scattered their rainbow light, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang out their timeless message of faith, hope, and love. In that moment, Mike Anderson knew with absolute certainty that their family's story was far from over. It was simply beginning a new chapter, guided by angels who had never really left them at all. Baby Thomas cooed softly, reaching for the scattered light, and Mike smiled, remembering Catherine's words from so long ago. Sometimes the greatest miracles are the ones we can't explain. We can only believe in them, treasure them, and pass them on to those who come after us. The restaurant filled with the sounds of Sunday brunch, of families sharing meals and memories, of love being passed from one generation to the next. And in the gentle Rochester breeze that stirred the daisies on every table, those who listened closely might have heard the whispered blessings of a chaplain who had never stopped watching over his flock, and a woman whose love had found new ways to shine.